Hebrews 13:7, we are admonished to remember the leaders who have gone before and consider the outcome of their lives and to imitate them. I believe that's nothing less than a command to do church history and to, in church history, find those models, not hagiographically, not indiscriminately, without recognizing faults and being honest about individuals, but seriously looking for those models that we might imitate and consider the outcome of their lives. We have the opportunity to do that this morning with Virginia Baptist in the late 18th century. Most Americans today, I think, believe that there has always been religious liberty in North America. The popular telling of American history goes something like this. The Pilgrims came aboard the Mayflower to Plymouth Rock, where they established a colony with a religious liberty for all. A few days later, the Declaration of Independence was written. And the next day, the Constitution was written with a Bill of Rights guaranteeing religious liberty. And we've all lived happily ever after ever since. Sadly, this is a myth. The reality is much messier. And that should not discourage your study of American history or history in general. It should encourage it. There's a lot of stuff there that we need to mine and uncover and discover. The truth is that while the Pilgrims came for their own religious liberty, the Massachusetts Bay Colony that resulted from their coming established Congregationalism as the official state religion, and they persecuted those who dissented from the state church. Roger Williams was forced into exile from Massachusetts in the 1630s, which led to his formation of the colony of Providence Plantation, where he established the First Baptist Church in the colonies in 1638. On September 5, 1651, Obadiah Holmes was beaten publicly in Boston, Massachusetts, because he was unwilling to pay the 30-pound fine imposed for holding a Baptist service in a private home. Isaac Backus cataloged the persecution of Baptists in New England during the 18th century, including the 13-day imprisonment in 1752 of his own mother for leaving the established Church of Connecticut and worshiping with a dissenting congregation. As late as 1801, the Danbury Baptists of Connecticut were appealing to President Thomas Jefferson because of their compelled tithe by taxation to support the state church. And in Virginia, as Thomas Kidd and Barry Hankins observe in the recent history of Baptists in America, the most spectacular instances of persecution against the Baptists in the decade prior to the War for Independence occurred in Virginia. I'm approaching this paper a little differently than I would typically in an academic type conference where there would be a thesis that's argued, a particular point, new kind of scholarship. Because this material is seemingly so unfamiliar to many, and because of the high percentage of seminary students who are here, who might be hearing this for the first time, what I want to do is kind of approach this with goals as I would in teaching a class. And so here are the goals that I have. You know, you get those course objectives. Do you ever read those on the syllabus? Course objectives, course goals. We are forced as professors to do those, to come up with those. So please read them. But here are the goals for this morning. I want to assert, as I already have, that religious persecution has happened in North America, especially in the period that we're looking at today in Virginia from 1768 to 1777, a decade. Second, I want to provide the historical background as to why or how persecution became a reality in Virginia. And third, I want to provide some examples, some evidence of that persecution, first-hand accounts, court records, information about that persecution. And then to describe some of the results of that persecution. And then finally, I want to encourage, inspire, and challenge you and me to similar faithfulness in the days ahead, no matter what may come. So first, background to that persecution in Virginia. Virginia was established as a colony with the Church of England as the official church. From the earliest days, there were strict laws requiring all citizens to conform to the Anglican Church. the late 18th century Virginia Baptist preacher John Leland explained the implications of the establishment of Anglicanism in the state Church of Virginia. The Church of England, he said, in Virginia, has no discipline but the civil law. The crimes of their delinquent members are tried in the courthouse before the judges of the police. Their censures are laid on at the whipping post, and their excommunications are administered at the gallows. Incoming settlers in Virginia were required to go to the local minister, the Anglican minister, to register and to give an account of their faith. Every head of family was to give a tithe of their tobacco crop to the church, along with any other crops. On February 24th, 1632, the Virginia House of Burgesses enacted the following law of religious uniformity for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And here's the law. It is ordered that there be a uniformity throughout this colony, both in substance and circumstance, to the canons and constitution of the Church of England, as near as may be, and that every person yield ready obedience unto them upon penalty of the pains and forfeitures in that case appointed. That the statutes for coming to church every Sunday and holy days be duly executed, that is to say, that the church wardens do levy 1 shilling for every time of any person's absence from the church, having no lawful or reasonable excuse to be absent. And for due execution hereof, the governor and council together with the burgesses of this grand assembly do in God's name earnestly require and charge all commanders, captains, and church wardens that they shall endeavor themselves to the uttermost of their knowledge that the due and true execution hereof may be done and had through this colony, as they will answer before God for such evils and plagues wherewith Almighty God may justly punish his people for neglecting this good and wholesome law. So they were serious about uniformity and conformity to the Church of England in Virginia. 30 years later, in 1662, the colonial government passed a law enacting a fine of 2,000 pounds of tobacco for those parents who refused to have their infants baptized in the Church of England. Whereas many schismatical persons, here's the statute, whereas many schismatical persons out of their averseness to the Orthodox established religion or out of the newfangled conceits of their own heretical inventions refuse to have their children baptized, be it therefore enacted by the authority aforesaid that all persons that in contempt of the divine sacrament of baptism shall refuse when they may carry their child to a lawful minister in that county to have them baptized shall be amerced or charged 2,000 pounds of tobacco, half to the informer, half to the public. The passing of this law has led some scholars to conclude that Baptists must have already have arrived in Virginia by this time. However, other groups, other individuals besides Baptists could have been rejecting the baptism of their infants. In fact, Lewis Peyton Little, who cataloged the records of the imprisoned preachers from the court records, unpublished manuscripts, letters, and other original sources in Virginia, observed that the laws against dissenters were so stringent and the supremacy of the establishment of the Church of England was so evident that Baptists were kept out of the Virginia colony for more than 100 years after it was settled. By this measure, Baptists did not arrive, or at least they didn't stay very long, in Virginia until the early 18th century. Following the Glorious Revolution, transferring to England for a moment just to understand how these laws were impacting Virginia, the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, which was the rise of William and Mary to the throne of England, the English Toleration Act was passed by Parliament the next year, 1689, which allowed dissenters from the Church of England to be exempt from attendance at their parish churches as long as they took an oath of allegiance to the crown, continued to pay their tithes, and attended their own churches on the same regular basis required by law. Now, this was not real religious liberty, right? That's toleration. You are allowed to exist, but only as long as you meet these certain stipulations. Now, that happened in 1689 in England, but it wasn't until 10 years later that kind of language or even a recognition that that act had been passed shows up in Virginia. In the Virginia legislature, it was recognized finally in 1699 some aspect of the Toleration Act which exempted penalties against dissenters as long as they worshiped in their own churches at least once every 2 months. Under the Toleration Act, ministers who wished to be allowed to preach to a gathering were required to obtain a license from the government. The first to obtain such a license in Virginia was the Presbyterian minister, Francis Makemie. The regular Baptists soon followed the Presbyterians in Virginia, and they seemed to have little problem following the guidelines of the act, which, in addition to requiring the obtaining of a license to preach, also mandated the oath of allegiance that I mentioned earlier to the crown and agreement to 36 of the 39 articles of the Church of England. Dissenters were exempt from the articles relating to church government and infant baptism. But by the 1760s, a new kind of Baptist, the separate Baptist, had begun to arrive in Virginia, and they arose in large numbers. Separate Baptists were those who had been converted during the Great Awakening of the 1740s or influenced as a direct result of that revival, and had broken away from their congregational or Anglican churches to form separate Baptist churches. This phenomenon is what caused the Anglican evangelist George Whitefield to lament, reportedly, "My chicks have become ducks," meaning that those hatched under his ministry had taken to the water. These separate Baptists would not be as easily controlled as their regular counterparts. Doctrinally, these two groups were very similar, for the most part affirming the same confession, the Philadelphia Confession of Faith of 1742. However, they followed the evangelism model of itinerants like Whitefield, who preached publicly in the open air. These Baptists were aggressive, sometimes militant. We would call them evangelistic. Anglicans were being converted by the droves and were being brought into these Baptist churches, and this led to the opposition to Baptists by the Anglican Church, which, wedded as it was to state government, was able to prosecute and therefore persecute. Many, but not all, of the separate Baptists would not take the license because of their conscientious belief that doing so would legitimize the power of the state to regulate religion. This put them at odds with the laws of Virginia. Most of their trouble, however, came because of their commitment to what Spurgeon would later call promiscuous evangelism in the public arena. So how were they persecuted? That's the reason they were being persecuted. How were they persecuted? Beginning in the 1760s, Baptists in Virginia were being persecuted. They were beaten, whipped, fined, attacked by mobs, and jailed. In an appendix to their book, Esteemed Reproach, which features 19th century biographies of Virginia Baptist preachers James Ireland and Joseph Craig, Keith Harper and C. Martin Jackman provide an extensive list of how Baptists were persecuted in Virginia during this period. Let me just summarize that list. Baptist preachers were cruelly and severely beaten with clubs or whips, pelted with apples and stones, ducked and nearly drowned, dragged from the house and driven away, commanded to take a dram of whiskey or be whipped, had guns put through their chest, were pursued by armed men, had their meetings broken up by mobs, were knocked down while preaching, pulled down and hauled about by hair, hand, etc. They were attempted to be suffocated with smoke. There was attempts to blow up a Baptist preacher, attempted poisoning. Lifetime injuries were received. Drunken rowdies were placed in the same cell with them in order to rough them up. They were threatened with public whipping. They had horses ridden over their hearers. They had men urinate in their faces. They were nearly pulled to pieces by mobs, were shot with shotguns, were sued for baptizing 2 boys, had hands slashed while preaching, and much more in that list. Now, in addition to all of those most of those were kind of like mob violence. There were also the imprisonments. And we have the most evidence for these because of the court records. So we have arrest warrants and we have court records, and so that's what I want to appeal to in much of what follows. One of the earliest examples of a Baptist preacher who was arrested, though he was apparently not jailed this time, was a man named Lewis Craig. Craig had two brothers, Elijah and Joseph, who were also Baptist preachers, and the three of them would be influential in the settlement of Kentucky and established many of the Baptist churches in Kentucky. He was a man who was a great sinner before his conversion and subsequent call to preach. And when he was indicted for preaching before a grand jury, he rebuked the court for only being concerned with his activity since he had become a preacher. He said, "I thank you, gentlemen of the grand jury, for the honor you have done me. While I was wicked and injurious, you took no notice of me. But since I have altered my course of life and endeavored to reform my neighbors, you concern yourselves much about me." One of the men on the grand jury that day was a man named John Waller, but he went at that time by the nickname Swearing Jack. Seems like a wholesome guy. The testimony of Craig made such an impression on Swearing Jack that he was later converted, joined the Baptist, and became a preacher, and was himself frequently imprisoned and persecuted for preaching the gospel. You'll hear more about him later, some of his records. During the 1760s and 70s, at least 34 Baptist preachers were jailed in Virginia. John Leland, writing very close to the time, wrote that about 30 of the Baptist preachers during this period were honored with the dungeon, and a few others beside. The few others were no doubt non-preaching Baptist church members who were in prison for supporting those who were doing the preaching. In his documentary history of the struggle for religious liberty in Virginia, Charles James provides a list compiled from multiple sources of those jailed between 1770 and 1774, so 5 years, right in the middle of the 10-year period we're looking at. And so he lists these. In December 1770, William Weber and Joseph Anthony were imprisoned in Chesterfield Jail. In May 1774, David Tinsley, Augustine Easton, John Weatherford, John Tanner, and Jeremiah Walker were imprisoned in the same jail. In Middlesex County, William Weber, John Waller, James Greenwood, and Robert Ware were imprisoned in August 1771. In Caroline County, Lewis Craig, John Burrs, John Young, Edward Herndon, James Goodwich, and Bartholomew Chewing were imprisoned, but the year is not given. In King and Queen Country, James Greenwood and William Lovell were imprisoned in August of 1772, and John Waller, John Shackelford, Robert Ware, and Iverson Lewis in March 1774. Dr. Taylor, in his sketch of Elijah Craig, says he was imprisoned in Orange County, but it's not given the year. According to Taylor's Virginia Baptist ministers, that were confined in Culpeper Jail at different times: James Ireland, John Corbally, Elijah Craig, Thomas Ammon, Adam Banks, and Thomas Maxfield. How many was that? Did you get the number? Okay, I'm just kidding. Okay, that was around 30 listed there. A total of 34 is the solid number that were arrested. Some of these, of course, arrested multiple times. Most of these arrested multiple times. The first recorded incident of any Baptist preachers who were actually imprisoned in Virginia, we know exactly when it happened, was in Spotsylvania County in the city of Fredericksburg on June 4th of 1768. And on this occasion, John Waller, along with Lewis Craig, the man whose testimony led to his conversion, James Childs, and William Marsh, were all four arrested by the sheriff, hauled before three magistrates who pronounced their indictment in the meeting house yard, and they required a penalty of 1,000 pounds and summoned them to appear in court 2 days later. They were arrested and imprisoned for what the court called, or what the lawyer accused them of being disturbers of the peace. Disturbers of the peace. And that was one of the common charges against the Baptists in this period. If they had a license or not, if they were preaching publicly, then they could be arrested and could be imprisoned because they would give this charge of disturbing the peace. By labeling Baptist preachers as disturbers of the peace, they were able to persecute them even though sometimes their preaching was not technically illegal. Early Baptist historian Robert Sample described how these preachers were accused. The lawyer said to the court, "May it please your worships, these men are great disturbers of the peace. They cannot meet a man upon the road, but they must ram a text of Scripture down his throat." This account explains how even those Baptist preachers who had obtained a license and conformed to the Toleration Act could still be arrested and imprisoned in late 18th century Virginia. In his History of the Catoctin Baptist Association, Fristow recounts, as the law was silent about dissenters, and no mode prescribed for their preaching, nor prohibition of it, nor for punish them on the count of it, justice of the peace and courts of justice took a different plan, pretended they were not persecuting religion when the Baptist preachers were taken and imprisoned, but that it was the peace and good order of the community they were aiming at, and so shifted the ground. They were not brought to the bar for religion, nor for their religious opinions, nor any of their rites, modes, or religious ceremonies, but as disturbers of the peace, the perverters of good order, and the calling unlawful assemblies together, taking the people from their necessary employment on their different farms and plantations, bringing the people into habits of idleness and neglect of their necessary business and interesting pursuits, and thereby reducing the inhabitants to want and distress. Now this should serve as a reminder to us that religious persecution does not always come as a result of a direct law against the practicing of Christianity, but instead sometimes through the application of other already existing laws in a way that is unfavorable to Christianity. Selah. What was the attitude of those prosecuted in this manner? After Craig and his 4 companions were sentenced, they were marched from the court to the Spotsylvania County Jail. And as they walked through the streets of Fredericksburg, they sang an Isaac Watts hymn. And the hymn is titled, "Broad is the Road." And I think the words of this hymn reveal what was on their hearts as they experienced persecution for their testimony for Christ. The lyrics go like this: "Broad is the road that leads to death, and thousands walk together there. But wisdom shows a narrower path, with here and there a traveler. Deny thyself and take thy cross is the Redeemer's great command. Nature must count her gold but dross if she would gain this heavenly land. The fearful soul that tires and faints and walks the ways of God no more is but esteemed almost a saint and makes his own destruction sure. Lord, let not all my hopes be vain. Create my heart entirely new, which hypocrites could ne'er attain, which false apostates never knew." These men, like the apostles in Acts 5, rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name of Jesus. And correspondingly, they considered those who were unwilling to suffer to be but almost a saint, and thereby revealing their eternal destiny. The prison bars did not stop these preachers from preaching. In fact, they used their prisons as pulpits. Morgan Edwards provides a record of the deportment while in the Fredericksburg jail. During their stay, they preached through the bars and were means of making very serious impressions on the minds of 11 heads of families and some of their domestics with many others. The populace did everything they could invent to keep the people off and to plague the prisoners, till at last they let the prisoners out in order to get rid of them. Many Baptist preachers who were arrested preached through the jail bars to any who would listen outside, and crowds would gather. In some cases, it is said that the Anglican ministers would pay their fines just to get them out of such a public place for preaching. Other examples of the kind of charges brought against Baptist preachers can be seen in the Chesterfield County court records. Chesterfield County was a county that was described in an early 20th century issue of the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography as one that all of the historians of the Baptist Church in Virginia refer to as one of those in which the prosecution or persecution of Baptist ministers in 1771 to 1773 was most violent. In January of 1771, there's a record of an appearance in court of Joseph Anthony and William Weber. Joseph Anthony and Anthony and William Weber being brought into court on a warrant issued against them for misbehavior by itinerant preaching in this county, being of that sect of dissenters from the Church of England, commonly called Anabaptist. And on hearing, they acknowledged that they had preached in the upper end of this county at a meeting of sundry people there, whereupon it is ordered that the said Joseph and William be committed until they enter into recognizance touching the premises themselves in penalty of 100 pounds and 2 sureties in penalty of 50 pounds each for the respective goods, etc., to be levied, etc., for their being of good behavior for the space of 1 year ensuing. Typically what happens when these preachers are arrested, they're given fines and then told, if we'll let you go, as long as you promise not to do anything, don't mess up for the next year. You're on probation for 1 year. A note was appended to this court record that indicated that both Joseph Anthony and William Weber offered to take the oaths to His Majesty's person and government and subscribe to the test and to be conformable as the law, commonly called the Toleration Act, requires. So they're saying, okay, we'll sign the license, we'll make the oath to the king. However, the court ruled that even by doing this, they would still not be allowed to preach publicly. This was evidently a common tactic by the court, since when Lewis Craig was finally released 4 weeks after his first imprisonment I talked about a few moments ago, 1768, he immediately appealed to the deputy governor, the Honorable John Blair, for the release of his fellow prisoners. So Craig was released first. They kept the other 4. He's trying to get them out. He appeals to the deputy governor. And Blair actually writes a letter to the king's attorney in Spotsylvania rebuking him and the court for failing to allow the imprisoned men to conform to the Toleration Act. And let me just share this letter, because this is one of those letters that as you hear it, it's kind of like, for those of you familiar with early church history, it's like Pliny the Young's early 2nd century letter to Emperor Trajan, because it reveals something about life in the church. One of the reasons we value that letter from the early 2nd century is because it reveals something about how Christians were perceived and what their practice was. And this letter from an unsympathetic source also reveals something about Virginia Baptist in this time that I think is very useful. So John Blair says, "Sir, I lately received a letter signed by a good number of worthy gentlemen who are not here, complaining of the Baptist. The particulars of their misbehavior are not told any further than their running into private homes and making dissensions. Mr. Craig and Mr. Benjamin Waller are now with me and deny the charge. They tell me they are willing to take the oaths as others have. I told them I had consulted the Attorney General, who is of opinion that the General Court only have a right to grant licenses, and therefore I referred them to the court. But on their application to the Attorney General, they brought me his letter advising me to write to you, that their petition was a matter of right, and that you may not molest these conscientious people so long as they behave themselves in a manner becoming pious Christians and in obedience to the laws till the court, when they intend to apply for license, and when the gentlemen who complain may make their objections and be heard. The act of toleration, it being found by experience," listen to this, "it being found by experience," he has this parenthetically, "it being found by experience that persecuting dissenters increases their numbers," close parentheses, "the act of toleration has given them a right to apply in a proper manner for licensed houses for the worship of God according to their consciences. And I persuade myself that the gentlemen will quietly overlook their meetings till the court. I am told they administer the sacrament of the Lord's Supper near the manner we do, and differ from our church in nothing but in that of baptism, and in their renewing the ancient discipline, by which they have reformed some sinners and brought them to be truly penitent. Nay, if a man of theirs is idle and neglects to labor and provide for his family as he ought, he incurs their censures, which have had good effects. If this be their behavior, it were to be wished we had more of it among us. But at least, I hope, all may remain quiet till the court. I am, with great respect to the gentleman, etc., your humble servant, John Blair." And this letter would eventually result, the advice would be heeded, and Craig's companions would eventually be released from jail. Another example from a court record of the kind of persecution and arrest that these Baptist preachers received from August of 1773, Jeremiah Walker, another individual we haven't been introduced to yet, was arrested for preaching to a gathered assembly, even though he was not a minister of the Church of England. Here's what the court record reads. Jeremiah Walker, who was committed by a warrant issued by Archibald Carey, gentleman, for sundry misdemeanors, being at the bar and acknowledging that he had convened the people in this county and preached to them, not being a minister of the Church of England within 6 months last past, the court being of opinion that such behavior is a breach of the peace and good behavior, do order that the said Jeremiah be committed to the jail of this county till he enter into recognizance himself and the penalty of 50 pounds with 2 sureties and penalty of 25 pounds each for his keeping the peace and being of good behavior for the space of 1 year next ensuing. Again, another example of how these Baptists were arrested for disturbing the peace and kept in jail and fined. In Middlesex County, in August of 1771, John Waller, Robert Ware, James Greenwood, William Weber, Richard Faulkner, and Thomas Wafer were arrested. The arrest warrant said that these men do labor and persuade many persons in communion with the Church of England to dissent from the same and utter doctrines destructive of the peace of society to the subversion of all religious establishments. When they were on trial, those charged reportedly responded that they had no power or authority for which they stand charged, but from above. Again, there's an echo in these Virginia Baptists of the attitude of the apostles who stated in Acts 5:29 that they must obey God rather than men. Not only do we have court records and arrest warrants that testify to the persecution that Baptists experienced in Virginia during this period, we also have some first-hand eyewitness accounts in letters and autobiographical accounts from those who were actually being persecuted. John Waller, formerly known as Swearing Jack. I'd like to keep that nickname probably. No, I guess you need to give that up if you become a preacher. He went from, it's like a Saul to Paul story, from Swearing Jack to John Waller, okay? He was arrested multiple times for preaching. In August of 1771, he was arrested and placed in prison in Middlesex County. He wrote a letter from prison that's preserved in Semple's History of Virginia Baptist of how he was arrested and how he was treated subsequently. So this letter is written to another Christian. Dear brother in the Lord, at a meeting which was held at Brother McCann's in this county last Saturday, while Brother William Weber was addressing the congregation from James 2:18, there came running toward him in a most furious rage Captain James Matog, a magistrate of the county, followed by the parson of the parish and several others who seemed greatly exasperated. The magistrate and another took hold of Brother Weber and, dragging him from the stage, delivered him with Brethren Wofford, Robert Ware, Richard Faulkner, James Greenwood, and myself into custody and commanded that we should be brought before him for trial. Brother Wofford was severely scourged, and Brother Henry Street received 1 lash from one of the prosecutors, who was prevented from proceeding to further violence by his companions. To be short, I may inform you that we were carried before the above-mentioned magistrate, who with the parson and some others carried us one by one into a room and examined our pockets and wallets for firearms, etc., charging us with carrying on a meeting against the authority of the land. Finding none, we were asked if we had license to preach in that county, and learning we had not, it was required of us to give bond and security not to preach any more in this county, which we modestly refused to do. Whereupon, after dismissing Brother Rawford with a charge to make his escape out of the county by 12 o'clock the next day on pain of imprisonment, get out of town by noon, high noon, and dismissing Brother Faulkner, the rest of us were delivered to the sheriff and sent to close jail with a charge not to let us walk in the air until court day. Blessed be God, the sheriff treated us with as much kindness as could have been expected from a stranger. May the Lord reward them for it. Yesterday, now here they are in prison, yesterday we had a large number of people to hear us preach, and among others, many of the great ones of the land who behaved well, while one of us discoursed on the new birth. we find the Lord gracious and kind to us beyond expression in our afflictions. We cannot tell how long we shall be kept in bonds. We therefore beseech, dear brother, that you and the church supplicate night and day for us, our benefactors, and our persecutors. I have to inform you that 6 of our brethren are confined in Caroline jail. Then he lists the names of 6 other preachers, including Lewis Craig, who are in jail in another county at the same time. The most dreadful threatenings are raised in the neighboring counties against the Lord's faithful and humble followers. This letter is instructive in its description of what a typical arrest and imprisonment might have looked like, as well as the description we see over and over again of these men preaching through the prison bars. It's also humbling in its appeal for prayer, a reminder of what we heard earlier from Voice of the Martyrs, that we should be praying for the persecuted church. It sounds like a letter we might receive from some of those persecuted brothers and sisters. Pray for us, pray for our benefactors, and then, most humbling, pray for our persecutors. The very same year, this same Waller, formerly Swearing Jack, I have to say that every time, Waller was confronted by both the sheriff and the local Anglican minister. The priest reportedly turned violent, jamming the butt end of a whip in Waller's mouth. And Waller was then dragged from the stage and horsewhipped. Morgan Edwards records that poor Waller was presently in a gore of blood and will carry the scars to his grave. So basically the posse that's there with the sheriff drags him down from where he's preaching, and they horsewhip him. He's a bleeding, mangled mess. How does he respond? He's said to have pulled himself up after the posse has left, the sheriff's left, they leave him there bleeding. He said to pulled himself up, gone back to the stage, and commenced preaching again. Another first-hand account of persecution comes from the autobiography of the Reverend James Ireland. Ireland, who ironically was of Scottish descent, had just preached outside while standing on a table in Culpeper County. While his eyes were closed praying his concluding prayer, he heard rustling in the woods behind him and was grabbed by the collar by 2 men. Stepping down from the table, he observed a large number of people walking toward him. His description of what happened next follows. The magistrates instantaneously demanded of me what I was doing there with such a conventicle of people. I replied that I was preaching the gospel of Christ to them. They asked, who gave me authority to do so? I answered, he that was the author of the gospel had a right to send forth whom he had qualified to dispense it. They retorted upon me with abusive epithets and then inquired of me if I had any authority from man to preach. I produced my credentials, presumably his ordination papers from his Baptist church, but these would avail nothing. Not being sanctioned and commissioned by the bishop, they told me that I must give security not to teach, preach, or exhort for 12 months and a day, or go to jail. I chose the last alternative. The magistrates then turned to address the crowd, and essentially they drew a line in the sand. They drew a dividing line by telling them that they were breaking the law, but they can escape the punishment of it if they will leave Ireland's side and come over to their side. And Ireland records that the people were much incensed against the magistrates and told them that they had heard nothing preached but the gospel of Christ. And if they had not money to pay fines, they were willing to go to jail also. This apparently, that was probably more than they could handle. So this apparently stopped the threats of the magistrates against the crowd, and they proceeded to summons Ireland to court a few days later. And here's what happened when Ireland gets to court. They browbeat me, maltreated me, and throwed out the most opprobrious appellations against me. Would admit of no defense I can make, but ordered me to hold my tongue and let them hear no more of my vile, pernicious, abhorrible, detestable, abominable, diabolical doctrines, for they were nauseous to the whole court. I found it of no consequence to defend myself any further, since imprisonment was inevitable, and they were determined to make an example of me. Ireland was then taken into custody by the sheriffs. The sheriffs were ordered, Ireland says, to attend me to my little limbo with a considerable parade of people with such volleys of oaths and abuse as if I were unfit to exist on the earth. A very uncomfortable night passed in consequence of the oaths, etc., that continued through the same. Sticks and stones they were throwing during the whole night upon me. Well, those are just some examples from the court records, from letters, from autobiographical testimony of the kind of persecution that these Baptists were undergoing. I want to take a few moments here toward the end to think about some of the results that came. And these are happy, positive results that came as a result of persecution. One thing that actually came out of this was religious liberty. One of the results was religious liberty. 10 years after the period discussed in this paper, religious liberty finally came to Virginia, when on December 16, 1785, the Virginia legislature passed the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, or religious freedom. The text, written by Thomas Jefferson, read, "Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities." It's interesting, if you go to Monticello and you see the grave of Thomas Jefferson there, at his request, there are 3 things that are listed there that he wanted included on any monument to him. And one of them, I believe, was the establishment of the University of Virginia, his authorship of the Declaration of Independence, and this statute for religious freedom. This statute largely came about as a result of the persecution of Baptists that men like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had seen in their own counties. The era of persecution was the backdrop of that. And it was also the backdrop of the guarantee of religious liberty that's now enshrined in the First Amendment. Legislator James Madison pushed for the Bill of Rights and authored the Bill of Rights and saw it passed because of the pressure he received from Virginia Baptist pastor John Leland. And that's another paper to talk about. But look into that, study that. As Harper and Jackman have noted, this freedom came with a price to Virginia Baptists. Many of their number had suffered inhumane treatment and brutality at their neighbors' hands, yet they all bore their reproach with a certain esteem. That is, they were thankful that they had been counted worthy to suffer for Christ's sake. Their stories serve as enduring reminders that Baptists played a significant role in securing this nation's religious liberty. In his 1930 Duke University Press work on the Great Awakening in Virginia, Wesley Guerra remarks, "By the time of the Revolution, the Baptists formed a considerable body of ardent religionists in the colony. With the outbreak of the war, they began a vigorous struggle for religious liberty, which did not end until church and state were completely divorced. This was one of the results of the Great Awakening, and it was closely identified with the development of democracy and politics." In the concluding paragraph of the book, Guerra concludes, "The rise of democracy was preceded and foreshadowed by the rise of religious dissent, which did much to crystallize the ideas and forces back of the American Revolution. The application of the principles of the Awakening, reinforced by the ideas of the Revolution, brought complete religious liberty to Virginia." Unfortunately, just as persecution had been a cause of growth to the Baptists through numerous conversions, religious liberty brought a decline in Baptist numbers. One scholar says, in that it gave them a chance to strike for religious freedom, the war came opportunely for the Baptists, but with it also came the first decided halt in the progress of the revival. With the cessation of persecution came, in the annual reports from the churches to the Virginia Baptist Association, mournful tidings of coldness and declension. The number of churches quickly plummeted from 60 or more corresponding churches to about 30 or 40. It's a strange truth from history that whenever the church is prosperous, it's also apathetic and ineffective. But when the church is persecuted, it thrives. We see that in this account. Another result of the persecution of Baptists in Virginia is one that I've already alluded to, the growth of the Baptist movement, the number of conversions during that period. Just as in the book of Acts, when Christians were persecuted and the church continued to grow, so too with the increased persecution of Baptists during this period, there was an increase in conversions. We saw that earlier in the letter of Deputy Governor John Blair, that he acknowledged that the more dissenters were persecuted, the more they increased in number. We also saw that John Swearing Jack Waller was converted due to the witness of Lewis Craig on trial. We've heard how the prisoners would preach through the iron bars to the crowds outside their jails. I now want to provide a final example of someone who was converted at the very end of the period considered in this paper through the preaching through the bars of Lewis Craig and John Shackelford. This man was named Ambrose Dudley, and he would go on to become a prominent pastor in Lexington, Kentucky area, where he served as the pastor of the Bryan Station Baptist Church from October 22nd, 1786, until his death over 39 years later on January 27th, 1825. So 39 years he's a pastor of Bryan Station Baptist Church. His son then follows and pastors about 40 years as well. So he was recognized as a leader by the other pastors of the associations to which he belonged. Elkhorn, he was a moderator of that association for a number of years, and the Licking Association he helped found, being moderator 25 times in total. He preached all over the countryside and was instrumental in this organization of several churches in Kentucky and even in Tennessee during his lifetime. He was converted through the preaching of persecuted Baptists in Virginia through the jail cell. And here's the story. In the spring of 1776, the War of Independence was just beginning. Dudley was moved by his ardent love of freedom to enlist in the Virginia militia in order that he might fight for the emancipation of his downtrodden country. Dudley was evidently a natural-born leader, because at the age of 24, he was immediately commissioned as a captain in the 2nd Regiment of the State of Virginia Line of the Continental Army upon his enlistment. One genealogical study says that Dudley was commissioned by his fellow Virginian patriot Patrick Henry. James Welch, who was later a missionary out in Missouri, parents were baptized by Dudley. He wrote this, that his manners and general habits seemed to indicate that he was born to exercise authority. He was 6 foot, fine personal appearance, unusually attractive, intelligent, and decided. So whatever the reason, Dudley seemed to rise to a position of leadership wherever he went. This was borne out in later years when he became the pastor of Bryan Station Church within a few months after having arrived in the community, and afterward he was elected as the moderator, as I mentioned, 25 times of the associations of which he was part. Before Dudley and his men marched into service in spring of 1776, his company was stationed in his own barn in Fredericksburg for 2 weeks. They then marched to the counties of Caroline, Hanover, King William, King and Queen counties to Williamsburg. They apparently remained stationed there for the remainder of Dudley's service. Dudley only remained in the Continental Army for approximately a year before he resigned his post for what he clearly considered a higher calling, the call to preach the gospel of Christ. At some point in 1776 or 1777, while stationed in Williamsburg, Dudley became, in the words of Welch, deeply impressed with his ruined condition as a sinner, being brought to feel that he had been all his life in an attitude of rebellion against an infinitely higher power than the King of England, even the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. James B. Taylor records the incident in the following terms. During the early part of the Revolution, he was commissioned to some office in the army, and while absent from home, his heart was pierced by the arrows of truth. He saw that he had all his days been waging war against his almighty sovereign, and in deep humiliation he cast himself before the throne, pleading for mercy. He was heard. His iniquities were forgiven. He became a loyal subject and avowed his subjection by being baptized according to the direction of his king. Each of these early accounts makes a not so subtle play on words regarding Dudley's involvement in the war against the King of England, and in his realization that in his sinful state he was also at war against the King of all creation. His conversion brought him into subjection to a higher power than King George III. Dudley's conversion experience would have brought a remarkable change in his life, since before his march to Williamsburg, he was not only openly immoral, but it was understood that he was inclined to infidel opinions. This would have meant that Dudley was known not only for his wicked lifestyle, but that he also held to agnostic and perhaps even atheistic views. So what or who were the instruments of Dudley's conversion to Christianity? William Pratt, who had personal communication with Dudley's son Thomas, indicates that Dudley heard Lewis Craig and John Shackelford preach through the prison bars in Williamsburg in mid-1777, at which hearing he was convicted of sin and led to the foot of the cross, where he found peace in believing in the ability and willingness of Christ to save. The words coming out of the jail window were, as James Taylor called, the arrows of truth, which pierced the heart of this military man in his mid-20s. Dudley was not ashamed to be identified with a persecuted minority of Baptists, as he subsequently submitted to the public demonstration of his new faith by being immersed. James Welch records the bold response of Dudley to the preaching of these prisoners. The conviction of his sinfulness was succeeded by a truly penitent and contrite spirit, associated with joy and peace in believing. He was at this time in command of his company and stationed at Williamsburg, and notwithstanding his circumstances seemed most adverse both to the culture of religion and to a public profession of it, he had too much firmness of purpose to yield to the influence of circumstances in so momentous a concern. He therefore publicly declared himself on the Lord's side by being baptized at Williamsburg. And if I mistake not, it was done in the presence of the company he commanded and some of his fellow officers in the army. This remarkable expression of humility and boldness undoubtedly made an impression upon his company, as also would his subsequent resignation of his position as captain in the Continental Army. Evidently, Dudley wanted to make a complete break with his life prior to his conversion. The men of this era, 1768 to 1777, and the surrounding period as well, I believe can serve as models for persecuted Christians in our day. Their faithfulness to Christ and conscience remains an inspiring reminder of the Christian call to discipleship. Writing within 30 years of the events described in this paper, Virginia Baptist historian Robert Semple provides an appropriate concluding word about the men who were persecuted in Virginia. There was an established religion. The Nebuchadnezzar of the age required all men to bow down to this golden image. These Hebrew children refused and were cast into the burning, fiery furnace of persecution. The Son of God walked with them there, to the utter dismay of their enemies. The decree finally went forth that none should be any more forced to worship the golden image. The establishment was overturned. May God use this conference to raise up men and women of God who will not bow to the golden images of our day, even if it means they be cast into the fiery furnace of persecution. Because wherever persecution is experienced for the cause of Christ, as the Virginia Baptist and persecuted Christians of every generation have found, Christ is present, and He is enough.